to talk about how you build a community product. So I'm going to start out by splitting the world into two big buckets, the product world into two big buckets. The first is community-centric products, and then community peripheral products. So the basic idea there is that some products, the community is completely core. It's integral to that product. And others, it's an amazing enhancement. It makes the product better. It makes it a much nicer experience for users, but it's not core. So a good litmus test for that would be if you took the community away, a community out of the product, could you still use the product? Like, could you use Meetup if there was no community? No, there'd be no meetups to go to. Or if you went to Wikipedia, would there be anything to read if there wasn't a community? No, there wouldn't. I put Duolingo on this slide. After listening to Christine's talk, it's actually quite interesting. I'd say that she might disagree with me on this, their language product is a community peripheral, but their language builder is 100% community-centric. Because if you took away the community, there'd be no language there being built. So this framework, I think, is very important because it affects how you think about building product. You should have a completely different lens. My background is in the community peripheral product building. I studied computer science and human-computer interaction. And then I went to work for Google, where I worked on Gmail, Maps, search, like a bunch of different consumer products. And then 2 years ago, I quit and I made the jump to a community-centric product. And we started working on Socratic. So Socratic's mission is to make learning easier. You know, out there when there are students trying to learn something and they're struggling, we want to be there to help them. We want to have an answer that will actually remove their confusion and teach them what they need to learn. And we want to do that for everyone in the world. We believe good teaching is an incredibly empowering force, and we want to give people access to good teaching in every topic, every subject, every language. So we have this huge mission, and we're trying to tackle that mission through community. It's our community that's creating all that content. We're not doing any of that, and they're driven by the same value and missions as we are. So during this talk, I'm going to talk about, first of all, over the last 2 years, I've learned a ton about building community-centric products, and the first thing for me is that it's incredibly humbling. It's very hard to build a product that's for a community. It's also very different than building a traditional product. It's also very exciting. So for the talk, I'm going to talk about old Chris from the left, as being if I say old Chris, I mean the person who thinks about product as a single-player game. New Chris is the one that thinks about it as a community, okay? So to illustrate the two ways of thinking, I'm going to use an example. This is a screenshot from Socratic, right? And if I had asked old Chris, what's the user experience here? What's driving the user experience? I would have looked at this and I've said, well, you've got a nice colorful banner, you have an owl, you're clearly trying to make students feel welcome, right? You've got these two buttons, you have these two affordances, one's to ask a question, one's to answer questions. Does that map to the use cases that students have? Does that map to what they really want? That's the set of questions I would have asked myself 2 years ago, right? I was totally missing the point, right? The user experience here is actually driven by community, right? So I've covered up everything that wasn't put on this page from our community, and there is no user experience, right? If you ask me, well, what's the user experience here? It's I don't know. I don't know what this site's about, right? So what's that tell us? It tells us that community is the product in this case. There's no product without community, right? If you think of product as user experience, so I use the product, what's the experience that I'm having, what am I feeling? It's basically a combination of the UI, the design, and the people I'm interacting with, the community who are on there. So this is the most important point of this talk. If you've got everything else, just remember this. I know you guys are all community folks, not product folks. So what that means for you is go find the product folks in your organization and make sure they get this, right? Because it should affect the way they think about all different sections of the product lifecycle, from what you decide to build, how you design it, how you test it, how you measure it. So I'm just going to go through and talk about a few lessons of things we've learned in each of these different stages at Socratic. We're definitely in a fail fast, learn quickly kind of mode, so hopefully you'll learn from the different things that we've tried. So this is a simple one. You should always look to what your users are trying to do. You should always try to figure out what behaviors do people have on my product today that I should empower. It's a lot easier to build for something that people are already doing than to try to change behavior. So very simple example here. In our math community, people were drawing graphs, taking their phones, taking a photo, uploading those, and then inputting them into the answers, because it's the only way to write a really good answer to some math problems, right? So we just looked at that. We actually built like an interactive widget now, which makes it a lot easier for contributors to input these graphs, and now students can actually zoom in, zoom out, pan. It's like a better experience for both the students and the people who are contributing on the site. It's actually really funny. I think you guys are all tweeting at me, so my phone's not, it's vibrating all the time. Room full of community folk, that's what happened. Okay, so this is a really interesting question. So we all have problems, like problems arise on our site. People aren't doing what we want them to, or something that's going wrong. And the question is, how do you solve that, right? Old Chris, like product folk, try to solve everything with product. It makes sense. If you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? But community is this amazing resource you have that you can also use to like solve problems and change behavior. So this is kind of a funny story. A few weeks ago, I was at home with my wife on the couch. We were getting ready, Sunday evening, getting ready to watch Game of Thrones. I open up my laptop, and to my abject horror, I see this on Socratic. Somebody came on Socratic, created an account called Pornhub, and started uploading animated pornographic GIFs. It was like literally the worst thing ever. I think my wife looks on my face and was like, did somebody die? Like, what happened? And so immediately we took the stuff down, and old Chris started thinking like, well, oh crap, like we've built systems to stop text attacks, but we haven't built systems to stop image attacks. Like, how can we figure out if an image is like abusive or shouldn't be up on Socratic? And I started thinking, it's like, well, okay, machine learning is really tricky. Like, can we build these features that will check these things before going up? And then I actually looked at what happened on the site. And what had happened is, so Pornhub had attacked us 2 hours before I realized it. And in that time, our community had noticed this and banded together and started taking down all the content that Pornhub was putting on. And Pornhub did this for hours. I don't know why you'd go onto a site and upload animated GIF after animated GIF for like 3 hours on end, but that's what this guy was doing. And our community didn't actually have the tools to stop him from doing that. So what they did is they were just waiting there, waiting for him to do his next move, and then immediately going and taking it down. And like, not only were they doing that, they were organizing between themselves, like saying, passing it off. Hey, it's getting really late here. Stefan, you're in Europe. Why don't you keep track of the site while I take some hours to sleep? So, you know, if you look at that, what we did is we didn't build any crazy product to prevent future attacks. We just enabled our contributors to do what they were already doing better. So we gave them the ability to shadow ban, like just they're the most trusted members of our community, but to shadow ban abusive accounts like this. And we'll build that cool product stuff later, but the site's way more resilient now than it would have been if we had tried to solve that from a product approach. Okay, and that leads into the next question, which is you can only do this if you have the right people in your community, which is really interesting because if you frame it that way, having the right people in your community is actually a product priority, right? Because if the user experience is driven by your community, and your community is driven by the top members of your community, because they're the ones who are going to set the culture, and they're the ones who are going to like grow that community, those top people have a huge impact on what the product experience is on your site. So you can justify like whatever it takes to go get, find, train, like have those people fall in love with your community. The same way as you would justify, we're going to spend 3 months doing design and engineering work to build this feature. Okay, so community also affects the way you should design features. And this is the second most important point in my talk. So if you're only going to remember 2 things, remember my first point and remember this one. You should be building to empower your community. You should not be building for outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Traditional product, you say, I want people to do X, whatever that is. I want people to click on this button more, right? That's your outcome. And now you're going to go and you're going to like design, create flows, create incentives, whatever it might be to get people to click on that button more, right? And success is all about, did we achieve that outcome? Did people click on the button 2 times, 3 times more than they used to? When you're building for community, what you really want is you want to give your community the ability to surprise you, right? You want to build functionality that lets them do things that you can't even imagine, because they're going to come up with way better ideas than anything we could come up with, and they're going to run with it. So an example here is when we launched math on Socratic, we needed to add the ability to write math equations, so like formulas, like fractions, things like that. And we looked around and we added a combination of these two technologies called ASCII math and MathJax. And we weren't really thinking, like, we were just trying to let people add math to the site, right? So what started happening is some of our best contributors, for example, Stefan, figured out a way to hack this math notation to turn it into a better teaching tool, right? So because when you're actually teaching someone, you want to like cross out, I don't know if you can see this, basically you want to like cross out units in a fraction so you can see what the remaining units are, right? And he figured out how to hack the system that we had like imported to do that, and then he went on Socratic and started teaching other people how to do the same thing, right? And the same thing happened with all these different types of notation, like how to do matrices, how to do color coding, all this kind of stuff that we had never thought of. And if we had not built an open-ended system, then it would have been months before Stefan emailed us saying, hey, it'd be great if you could cross out fractions, right? And then it would have gone into our product queue. Then eventually, like, we would have gone over and designed it, and then we'd have deployed it. And that whole thing probably would have taken like 2 months. And because it's not super top priority, it might have taken longer. Whereas just because we built an open-ended system, these people figured out how to do this on their own, and that should always be your goal. To support this even more, what we did is we took a page out of, like, Stack Overflow has a Stack Meta, which is great. We basically created Socratic Meta, which is designed for open-endedness. Like, we didn't know how people were going to use it, and that was the whole point. It's a place where community members can come, talk to each other, and figure out how to make Socratic better. And we launched this, and this is where community members rallied when the Pornhub guy came and attacked the site. This is where they organized themselves. So from now on, we're thinking about, when we think about new features, like how can we build with an open-ended design? Okay, this is something we spent a lot of time working on at Socratic. It's basically using a product online can feel like a very solo experience, like a single-player experience. But really, on Socratic, you're part of this larger community. So how can we design the site in such a way that as you're going through and taking your actions, you feel like you're part of that larger community? So these are a few different examples on the site. My favorite one's the bottom one. So I'm going to ask them in 1 second to click on that link. But before they do that, our goal was to make contributors feel like what they were doing on Socratic was worthwhile and it was having an impact, right? And we thought about that and we're like, well, something that's pretty amazing about the internet is the scale you can reach. Like, how many people can you reach through your actions online? And like, how much, that's so much bigger than what you can do in person. So we were like, okay, so page views is a really interesting metric to show how much impact you're having as a contributor, right? Now, if we had, look at what's going on here. Look at the top of the page. This is a user profile of one of our oldest contributors on Socratic. And every dot represents a place where a student has seen the content that he's contributed. This is a much more compelling way to show page views than a number, right? If we had given, like, our first idea was like, let's give them a static graph, right? It's like, okay, have your page views gone up this week versus last week? Where when you put it on a map, all of a sudden that number feels a whole lot more like a bunch of people, right? And it's a bunch of people that you're directly impacting. So there are things you can do in designing your experience that make you feel like you're part of the community. Go back to the slide. Another interesting point here, which reinforces the idea that community is product, is who's on your community matters. So let's say I'm a young woman and I come to Socratic and I look around and what I'll see is a whole bunch of profile pics, right? And in those profile pics are faces. Now, if I look at a site and I see a whole bunch of like old men and I don't see any women or any young women on that site, I'm probably not going to feel like that site's for me, right? And so if you're not thinking about community as product, you're going to be sending all these signals to users that you're not intending to send, right? So like, this is something that we made this like little meet the community widget. And the idea there is that we're just showcasing really diverse set of contributors because we want all kinds of people to feel welcome and happy on Socratic and to be contributing. And we make sure we surface that to new users all the time. Okay, so how do you test it? This is the total time, right? This is 25 minutes, this counter here? Okay, moving on. Okay, so big rule in product is your intuition is usually wrong. You can't build product based on intuition. You need to test something, see how people actually react to it, and then iterate on it. That's especially hard when you're building a product for community. And that's because you can't test a community product in a vacuum, right? You need to test that feature with your community. Now, how do you do that without building the whole feature? So our community lead, Becca, who's here, had this great idea that we should create a mentorship program between really esteemed high-level contributors and new promising contributors, right? So we're like, this sounds really good. How can we test this out without building the whole feature? Because that's going to be a hard thing to build. So Becca went off and thought about it. And it's like, what's the minimum functionality we need on the site to enable us to test whether this is a good idea or not? And what she came up with is she realized that she could do it as long as we could mention people in comments, right? If you could mention a person in a comment, then she could go in and answer and say, hey, Gio, you're now a mentor to Stefan, right? Why don't you give each other feedback on your answers and build a relationship? And that's all that she needed to do in a super scrappy way. And she built a Google spreadsheet where she kept track of this relationship. So instead of building a very specific, deterministic feature for mentors, which actually wouldn't have worked, we actually ran this test and we learned the way we did it didn't make a lot of sense. We actually need to build it another way. We need to get more buy-in from the mentees. What we did is we built a very open-ended feature, which is @mentions, which is something we've wanted to build for a long time, but we had a forcing function to actually build it for this test, and now our community is going to use it in a bunch of ways we didn't expect. Something that I completely did not appreciate when we started working on Socratic is that the timelines for community products are completely different from traditional products. So communities, in my view, are essentially a network of individuals with relationships between them that have come together under a common goal. And human relationships are built in human time, right? You can't build a human relationship with somebody from one day to the next. That needs time and needs to build each other. Same thing with a community. A community, when it's in an embryonic stage to when it's growing to when it's developed and healthy, it takes time and it's ready for different things. So something that we failed at this. Early on in our lifespan, we put up a forum for the different contributors on Socratic. And we used discourse, and we put what we thought were really interesting starter threads, and we reached out to different people, and it didn't work. It was we think it was just too early, right? People were not active, and actually not only did it not work, it hurt us because new people would come and they'd look at the forum and they'd say, oh wow, this is an empty party. I don't want to join this party. I'm going to go join some other party, right? So we ended up taking it down. Waited. I think it might have been a year between these two things until we relaunched Meta, which is now working great. And there may be a bunch of different reasons there, but honestly, I think the biggest one is just there's a critical mass of people who need a forum and are very excited and engaged in Socratic and want that place. And now it's been a fantastic tool, and it's recruiting people to be more and more engaged in all levels of our community. And last point here is how do you measure? So I don't have a silver bullet here. But what I do know is that metrics are really important because what you measure determines what you're going to optimize for. And if you choose metrics that aren't consistent with your community goals, then you're going to optimize for the wrong things, right? So at Socratic, a metric we care a lot about is how many new answers we're getting every week, right? And this is the graph over the last few months of answers on Socratic, and it's up on to the right, and that's great. And this is what we had on our internal dashboard. We have this screen that flashes different metrics that we care about, so we're all aware of them. Over the last few months, we tried to revamp our metrics and actually design them so it maps what's going on with the community. And when we did that, we've always known that we actually have sub-communities around subjects. We don't have one big community. We have a bunch of smaller communities around subjects. We did that. We actually, these graphs look very different, right? And they tell a very different story. So overall, Socratic is growing. We're getting way more answers. But for example, something weird happened in statistics, right? And we should figure out what that is, because there's some weird experience that happened to people there, and that's a lot more telling than this aggregate number. So basically, the advice there is choose metrics that are proportionate to what the human experience of contributing or being part of that community might be. So again, if I'm going to leave you with one thing, just remember that community is part of the product, and community is the product. And if your product people don't buy that, try to convince them. If you can't convince them, send them to me. I'll try to convince them. And that's it. So thanks a lot.